Greetings, Debbie, and to other midwives who might watch this. Some of you may know me. I lived in New Zealand from 1995 until 2020. I'm now living in Mexico, and I'm coming back to New Zealand, and Debbie and I and Andrea Vincent are going to chat in early February. Once again, I'm trying to encourage the New Zealand midwives to fill in a gap and grow a stronger partnership model. In order to do this, I need to go back and explain the New Zealand history and the American history that led me to come into New Zealand and to then develop what was known as the Pink Kit and is now known as Birthing Better. We are where we are because of our pasts. When I got to New Zealand in 1995, I was welcomed by immigration because of these skills. The person who welcomed me, and I will always regret not keeping that lovely letter, was that person saw that what I was bringing into New Zealand were childbirth, pregnancy, and birth skills that New Zealand families could learn for themselves. And the response in that letter was, New Zealanders are cluey, they're number 8 wire people, and there's a partnership model now between midwives and families, and midwives are highly skilled, and families can now become highly skilled by what you're bringing into New Zealand. And so I thought that I was in the right place in the right time. I had spent 25 years developing these skills with hundreds of mothers and fathers in the United States, and then talking at conferences around the world. Between the 1970s and the mid-1980s, there was a huge change in childbirth, and that's the gap that I want to fill in today, so you know what was happening to me and to the global childbirth conversation by the time I got to New Zealand in 1995. So I thought that I was in the right place at the right time because New Zealand midwives had become an autonomous profession in 1990, and they had a partnership model. And so I felt and knew that the skills that I was bringing in to New Zealand could strengthen the partnership model by growing a skilled birthing population. There were some hitches. The main hitch was that I was still carrying this all in my head because technology had not caught up. It wasn't until 2000 that we were able, our New Zealand nonprofit Common Knowledge Trust, was able to create the first resource, which was the Pink Kit. And that was a VHS, a book, and a cassette. And that was only one of the 4 skill sets that families had developed. Within a few years, CDs and DVDs became available, and so I created more of the resources, and then there were digital downloads, and now learning management systems online. So let me go back to early history. So I read Women's Business, and I read The Trouble with Women, and I read Brandt's study that was conducted in the 1960s at Women's Hospital. So what I'm going to explain to you is my understanding of New Zealand from the 60s until the mid-80s, and what was happening in the U.S. at the same time, because those histories were different. And in the 1980s, the childbirth conversation became global. So how America got to the 1980s and how New Zealand got to the 1980s were 2 different histories. So let me talk about what I understand about New Zealand first. New Zealand is a OECD country, the Commonwealth, and you've always had midwives, and you've always had home births, and your primary care provider for maternity and birth were general practitioners, and women were referred to obstetricians. That's different in the United States. You also had Parent Center. And Parent Center offered childbirth classes. Those classes were Grantley Dick Reed classes to begin with, and then Lamaze classes. Because Grantley Dick Reed, Lamaze, and Bradley were advocates of natural birth for low-risk women in New Zealand, general practitioners had to evaluate whether a woman was low risk and then give her a script to attend one of those classes. At that point, fathers were not permitted into birth, so the Brant study did not include fathers as birth coaches. In New Zealand, the changes that occurred in the 1980s in the United States, which I will explain in a minute, were not as profound. But the global interest in natural birth and a midwifery-led maternity system became very active in the 1980s, and New Zealand turned over the maternity system to an autonomous direct entry midwifery profession in 1990. So let me stop there and go and tell you a little bit about the United States. I gave birth in 1970 in the United States. That was the end of the very first childbirth trend, which was a skills-based childbirth trend. As you may know, every state in the United States has a Medical Practice Act. We're not part of the Commonwealth. Midwives had been outlawed in 1957, and although some women had home births, everybody was going to the hospital, and obstetricians were the lead maternity care, and obstetrical nurses attended women in the hospital. Fathers were coming into birth long before they were coming into birth in New Zealand. And from the end of the 1950s until the mid-1970s, millions upon millions of American families attended hospital-based Lamaze classes. And they went into the hospitals under obstetrical care with lots of assessments, monitoring procedures, and men and women worked together using Lamaze techniques. And some families had learned Bradley method. That was considered to be more natural birth method, but both really were focused on that. In my years of working in traditional communities and around the world, I came to understand that there were 3 childbirth goals. The first is a live mother. Traditional people accept a dead baby at birth. And modern medicine, until the 1980s, accepted a dead baby at birth as well. And I'll explain that in a minute, what changed. The second, traditional women, from my experience in many traditional communities, is that there were 2 fears around birth. One was a stuck baby. If a baby was stuck, eventually the baby would die, and eventually the mother would die. The second one was if women bleed too much. They're not so much concerned about blood right after the birth, but it's the bleeding for days after the birth, because traditional communities are not aware of hydration. So those were the 2 primary concerns. The World Health Organization concerns in training traditional birth attendants were not the same concerns. Traditional communities don't care if women are having twins. They don't care if there's an early membrane rupture. They don't care if the cord is presenting. They don't care if the woman is having a breech birth. They don't want the baby stuck, and they don't want the woman bleeding significantly for days after the birth. So you have three basic groups of people around birth who have opinions: traditional communities, the natural birth movement, and the medical movement. That first goal, a live mother, was accepted in the United States when I gave birth in the 1970s. It was accepted that a baby could die at birth. The cesarean rate in 1970 was 5%. It was major abdominal surgery, only done if a woman could die. Prior to that, as you know, there were sometimes that babies were cut up inside to get the baby out. So when I gave birth in 1970, multiple millions of families had been taking Lamaze classes and using Lamaze skills in hospitals in the United States, because the second childbirth goal is how do you deal with suffering. And Lamaze and Bradley were the first two ever worldwide childbirth skills methods ever presented to humanity. In all of the traditional communities I've been in, 30 of them, no traditional community has specific skills for what women do during birth. Because birth is unknown, you never know what it's going to be like. And so when I used to teach the Birthing Better skills in traditional communities, everybody wants the skills. They do not want the midwives teaching it. The midwives do not want to be teaching it because they feel they'll be held accountable if something goes wrong. So Lamaze, and having a husband there, meant that women in the United States, those multiple millions of us, we coped better rather than suffering. That was not acknowledged by the nascent natural birth movement that was beginning in the United States and also beginning in New Zealand and in Europe. The natural birth movement from early on had three goals: that low-risk women at that point could learn Lamaze or Bradley skills and have a natural birth, and that word natural was never defined, with pain-free labor because of Grantley Dick Reed, childbirth without fear, and without medical assessments, monitoring procedures. The word interventions weren't used until the 1980, and then they were implied to mean unnecessary and imposed on women. And it changed in the 1980s because the childbirth trend in the United States changed from a skills-based childbirth trend where women lacked choices to a choice-based childbirth trend where there were no skills, because the natural birth movement and famous authors made comments such as, cows and cats aren't taught to birth, women don't need to learn skills. It's instinctive. Women need to be left alone. Fathers shouldn't coach and tell women what to do. They should just support women's choices and protect the sacred space of labor. But in 1970, when I gave birth, we were all going into the hospital. All of us were learning Lamaze skills, which were the beginning skills, which meant they were not very sophisticated. They worked for some people and didn't work for others. And everybody was using them, whether they were diagnosed as high risk or diagnosed as low risk, or whether risks developed they just developed, because risks are known or unknown. Thankfully, the problems that can develop from risks either self-resolve or can be resolved by people doing things, and few problems become tragedies. But the traditional communities and the modern communities recognize that women have a lot of risks. And if you look at 1,000 childbearing women who are not pregnant, you will acknowledge that many of them have risks. They may not be big risks, but they can be risks that then can become problems. And thankfully, most problems resolve or can be helped. And thankfully, there are few tragedies. So a live mother is the first childbirth goal. The second childbirth goal is suffering. So Lamaze and Bradley's skills began to reduce suffering in childbirth because women were using skills and fathers were helping them use skills. And so my generation of families from the United States felt empowered by their birth, even though they had lots of assessments, monitoring, and procedures, and sometimes tragedies. Doing the activity of birthing our baby had a massive positive impact on the birth memories or the birth story we have had for the rest of our life. And that is true of the men of my generation as well. They were better fathers because they were included in the birth of their baby, with the exception back then in 1970 of women having cesareans. But only 5% were. But they were given a general anesthetic, and it was a classical incision. And having a vaginal birth after cesarean was frowned upon. So in the United States, I want to just talk about it a little bit longer. Things changed in the 1980s very, very dramatically. The cesarean rate went up to 15%. There were authors who said that doctors were running around with scalpels wanting to get to the golf course, and that was not accurate as to why the cesarean rate rose. It was because of societal changes. And in the United States, what were those societal changes? And they bled out into other communities as well. So you can go back into your New Zealand history and think about this as well. In the United States, it became available to have birth control pills. And it became legally available for women to have an abortion. And women had spent decades trying to have access to work outside the home, which happened. And therefore, families reduced the size of how many children they had. And that put pressure on the childbirth goal number 1, live mother. So by the 1980s, in the United States, and I don't know when this occurred in New Zealand, it was both a live mother and a live baby. The other thing that happened in the 1980s was women in the United States started to wear bikinis. They didn't like the ugly scar of a cesarean. And there was talk then about vaginal births after cesareans, because cesareans were done to save a woman's life. And when she got pregnant another time, if her life was not in threat, there were women who wanted to have a vaginal birth after cesarean. The Birthing Better skills developed in the early 1970s. The primary first skills that fathers and mothers developed were improved breathing, because Lamaze and Bradley breathing didn't always work. For Lamaze, breathing in and out your mouth for hours was unsustainable. Bradley method was in the nose and out the mouth. And fathers were coaching. So if a father heard a woman doing this or doing this, it was in the nose and out the mouth. If he heard her doing this, or to him, she was breathing in the nose and out the mouth. And the woman was saying, why isn't he helping me? So fathers and mothers who developed the skills, we then worked on breathing skills. What are the 4 ways that humans breathe? How do we find in ourselves the breathing skills or patterns that indicate that we are coping? We also developed the relaxation skills, because 1970s to the 1980s, the natural birth movement in the United States wanted women to get off their back and wanted them to get in a gravity position. but they're not body workers. I came from a bodywork background. And one thing I want all of you to know is that I never cared about childbirth. I don't care how anybody has their baby. It is not a passion of mine. It's not even an interest of mine. So why have I spent almost 60 years of my life talking about this? Because the fathers and mothers who developed the skills asked me to, and because we knew from our experience of thousands of us that when we use skills to birth our baby, to do the activity of birthing our baby, we felt better about the experience we had, both mothers and fathers, and it built our families because we were both involved. So, I don't know, what the fuck did I just say? So relaxation for Lamaze was basically being a rag doll. But that's external relaxation. A baby has to relax, has to come through the woman's body. So we had to learn about internal relaxation. But those skills didn't develop until the 1980s, when the cesarean rate tripled. At that point, fathers would look at a woman who was very pregnant and say, big object in the container. Can't change the object. Can we change the container? And we could. So all of the body skills that were the pink kit were developed in the 1980s primarily by fathers because men and women share the exact same body. So when we developed the skills, women could do the skills on men, and that would give them confidence to do the skills on their pregnant partner. But the relaxation skills were very important. Relaxing outside was not important. Understanding tension inside was important. And the third skill set that we developed from the 70s to the 80s was touch. Because a lot of women, if a man saw a woman struggling in birth, he'd reach out and touch her, and she could most often growl at him or flip his hand off and say, don't touch me. And then that man never knew when to touch again. So we knew that communication was important, relaxation was important, breathing was important, and touch was important. So we developed those skills, and those skills are now in our resources, but we're not in the pink kit. So I'm going to continue with the United States for a little bit longer because the United States never developed what New Zealand did. And when I came to New Zealand, I saw a midwifery model of care that had a huge gap. It did not have a strong partnership model. It was based on 3 words, that pregnancy and childbirth are normal, natural, and physiological life events. We all agree with that. But what do those words mean? If they mean what the natural birth movement, which is it's easy, it's natural, it's instinctive, all goes well, very few tragedies, just trust it and don't have medical things happen if you're low risk. If that's what it means, why did New Zealand midwives have to go to school for 3 and then 4 years? That's a gap. That doesn't make sense. But it does because midwives are there to safeguard the health and well-being of the mother and baby. That's good. That's important. And they remain the lead maternity carer, even if a woman is seen by an obstetrician. This is good. However, the gap in the partnership is an unwillingness, and literally a chosen unwillingness to recognize that you are in a partnership relationship with a family that has to do the activity of birthing their baby. Women don't give birth. They do the activity of birthing their baby. It's an activity. And that activity can be full of skills, even if we just knew the breathing, the communication, the touch, and relaxation skills that were more effective than the Lamaze or the Bradley methods. It's not putting those 2 systems down. It is recognizing at the beginning of global change things that develop aren't as sophisticated as what comes after them, because the gaps, when you use those new systems, become obvious, and you start to fill those gaps. So in New Zealand, from the 70s to the 80s, the natural birth movement grew, and so did Parent Center. Brandt did a study in 1962 that showed that skills had a positive impact on the woman's perception of childbirth. Husbands weren't permitted in, so they had outside teachers and outside birth coaches. But what he also discovered in that study was that the people working with skilled birthing women were elated by working with skilled birthing women. And that's what Andrea Vincent discovered by working with skilled families. And that helps strengthen the partnership model. By the 1980s, the natural birth movement had become a global movement with a desire for midwives to attend, both at home, in birth centers, and hospitals, low-risk women. In 1990, when New Zealand midwives became the lead maternity carers, they did something absolutely remarkable. They chose to be the lead maternity carer for all of maternity, for every pregnant woman in New Zealand. This was way outside of the original goal of the midwifery model. Even the World Health Organization model is not about midwives attending high-risk women. If they're in the villages, the expectation is they will transport them to the clinic and then to the hospital. So New Zealand midwives gave all women in New Zealand this amazing partnership. By the 1980s, there was a strong divide. It became known as the mummy wars. Breastfeed, bottle feed. Nurse at night, don't. But it was all about natural birth or medical birth or home birth or hospital birth or obstetricians or midwives. This has been crazy because 100% of pregnant women are going to give birth one way or another. The birth of every baby is important to each family. If a woman's going to have a cesarean and she needs to get to the hospital, she can use skills. And she can enjoy learning skills with her partner beforehand, which brings them closer together. She can use skills while she's waiting and being prepped. She can use skills during the surgery and after the birth if she has discomfort. It's an activity. She's living with the birth memories she creates. So when women are saying to other women, your cesarean isn't really a birth, this is women being mean to each other. And this has been happening since the 1980s. If we grew a self-learning, skilled birthing population for all births, we would stop some of the nonsense. But what we would do in New Zealand is to strengthen the partnership. New Zealand midwives go to school for 4 years. Our nonprofit, which has now been closed, sent out a flyer, I think in 2013 or 2016, inviting 100 to 150 midwives to spend $30 a month in 2 years to work with me from the trust to learn how Andrea grew a self-learning, skilled birthing population. Now in New Zealand, there was something that was also happening, which is that technology was not available. So having resources, skills-based resources, was not possible. There wasn't the technology. There was a book, maybe a class. When we came out with the Pink Kit VHS book and a cassette, that was really one of the first multimedia resources that became available for people to learn from. When I came to New Zealand and immigration welcomed me, and I thought it was the right time and the right place, I presented at the 1996 NOSCOM conference, thinking that what I was saying, because I had presented some of the skills in 1988 in New Plymouth, that what New Zealand midwives would say is, we like that idea. We like the idea of having a strong partnership because families are learning skills for themselves. But remember, in 1996, when I talked at the conference, there were no resources. Maybe you could get Lama's book in a library, but it took years for technology to catch up, and now we have online courses. So when we sent out that flyer in 2016, there were available multiple skills-based methods. So the flyer was simple. Simple message. Hi, I'm your midwife. I went to school to safeguard the health and well-being of your baby. We're in a partnership. You're going to do the activity of birthing your baby. Please choose from this list one or more skills-based methods. Let me know what they are. I don't need to learn what the skills are. But every appointment, come and let me know what skills you learned, or if you didn't learn a skill, we're going to just write that down. You learned breathing. You didn't learn anything this time. And those will be in your notes. They don't have to be complicated notes. And at the birth, if the birthing woman and her support person are using skills together, compliment them. If they're not using skills, then anyone can look back on the notes. So for example, a woman who planned a natural birth and is having a cesarean, she might be not breathing well, but in her notes she learned breathing. Remind her and tell her, you're doing the activity of birthing your baby. You're going to have lifetime memories of this. So work through the activity of birthing your baby with skills and get families to work together. The idea that fathers should not be coaches, which was promoted by Michelle O'Donnell and other natural birth advocates, was absolute nonsense. It's absolute nonsense because you need to grow families. And when fathers were not involved in births, they were thumbs up. When fathers were not involved in births, they were awkward with their newborns, and women often pushed them away. But when men and women work together to develop skills for birth, and they work together during the activity of birthing their baby, men have confidence with their newborns, and women have confidence in their men and their partners to be with the newborns. So growing a skilled birthing population is about growing the family. It's not about growing the midwifery skills. It's not about midwives teaching the skills. It's not about midwives doing the skills. Now, Andrea worked with 3 other women. Andrea decided in 2000 that she wanted to change. And the pink kit was available, and we told her, give the pink kit to families and tell them to do it themselves. At the end of the year, she had to keep statistics, and she can talk to you about this. 30% of her clients self-learn the skills. That's a massive percent of the general population. She notated what happened with those who learned the skills of the pink kit. Those who didn't do the internal work had slightly different second stages than those that did do the internal work. She wanted the other 70%, because she liked working with skilled families, to come on board, and she found that they were resistant. They were resistant because of the message being given in New Zealand, and the same message in the United States. Childbirth is a normal, natural life event. Cows and cats aren't taught to birth. Women don't need to. It's all about birth choices and your care provider giving you the birth that you want. So it took Andrea a long time to change how she was approaching people to get a greater percent of her clients to self-learn the skills. And she can talk to you about that. Her cesarean rate went down from 23% and stayed between 4 and 9% for the 20 years that she and I worked together in New Zealand. That could have been achieved had the New Zealand College of Midwives had any interest in what I was bringing into New Zealand. They had any interest into the concept that a strong partnership is better than having a weak partnership. in which midwives are taking on too much of the work and become exhausted, and women are too dependent on them. When I first came to New Zealand, there was an article, is a midwife a friend? In Midwifery Today, is she a professional or a friend? So the midwifery profession in the United States and in New Zealand and probably around the world really was dealing with that issue. Are midwives your friends? Are they your birth coaches? Are they the ones who teach you? Or are they just professionals and you have things that you have to do as an adult? This is a conversation. So Andrea worked with 3 other women. One woman didn't believe that people needed skills. Another of the midwives believed that midwives should learn the skills and do it on their clients when necessary. And the third believed that the midwives should teach their clients. So it was always a conversation at first with Andrea. Don't teach, don't do, just give them and tell them it's their job. I was accused of self-promoting. I understand that. There were no other skills-based methods in New Zealand at the time that the pink kit came out. However, if people had looked a lot broader at what I was saying and what we were doing, it was about growing a self-learning, skilled birthing population. And if the pink kit was the only resource at that time, it would have changed childbirth in New Zealand because that resource focused on the body skills. So let's go back to the 1980s. I don't know what happened exactly in New Zealand. You had the parent center classes. You had switched over to Lamaze classes, but it was still focused on low-risk women. And midwives were still in charge, but they weren't in charge the way that they'd like to be in charge. So from 1980 until 1990, things changed in New Zealand, and the New Zealand midwifery model was put into place. That was not true in the United States. What changed in the United States was the families that I worked with looking at the change in childbirth due to the societal changes and the rise in cesarean rates. What was the most common cause of cesareans? Slow labors. And what's the greatest fear in traditional communities? Stuck babies. A slow labor is a stuck baby. It was accepted in the 1970s that women could labor for 70 or 90 hours. It was accepted. But when women got birth control, had access to abortion, were going out to work and reducing the size of the families, they did not want to have long labors. And the women who wanted to try for vaginal birth after a cesarean didn't want to be put at risk by having a classical cesarean. So the doctors came up with the bikini cut because we were wearing bikinis and we didn't want that ugly scar. And we wanted it safer to have a vaginal birth after cesarean. Because by the 1980s, that was one of the new trends, VBACs, because the cesarean rate was rising. And many of the initial families that I worked with in the 1980s were the ones that developed the skills in the pink kit, primarily the fathers, because they saw a big object has to get out of the container. Men have always been the most pragmatic of the developers of what is called the Birthing Better skills now. In fact, in the 1990s, fathers came up with the Pregnancy Academy skills because men would say, look, at 24 weeks, I can begin to feel the baby. We know it's more than halfway through the pregnancy, but I've been running to catch up with her since she got pregnant 6 months ago. So they developed the 10 skills in the Pregnancy Academy to use through each of the 5 phases of pregnancy. One of them might be patience. If a woman got pregnant and they have a close sexual relationship and then she's vomiting and doesn't want to be touched and doesn't want to have sex, the man doesn't know what's happening. So yes, he can be patient to her, but he needs to be patient to himself. He can't feel his baby for another 6 months, but she's pregnant 24/7. So he has to learn to be patient to the baby as well. So there are 10 skills that men developed that would help them work through the 5 phases of pregnancy. And then the skills that they could begin to use at 24 weeks to prepare the pregnant body, learn the birthing skills, and at 32 weeks start to do the internal work. And as Andrea will tell you, people who do the internal work 5 minutes a day for 8 weeks, their second stage has a profound positive change. And she can tell you about 2 women about the same age, first-time mothers. One did and one didn't, and what happened when both of their babies went into distress. And one woman was able to say after the birth, my doing the internal work protected my baby. And the other woman was able to say after the birth, not doing the internal work helped cause the problem that my baby had. So what is strengthening the partnership model? At a certain point, when I came to New Zealand, as I said, there were no resources available, not even ours, but the idea was there. And what I was saying to people was, 1 is sharing the skills, and 2 is talking about how important it is for families to become skilled. But at that point, I did not know that a doctor had to give a script to a woman to define her as low risk before she could attend a natural birth class at Parent Center. I had to read Trouble with Women and Women's Business and the Brant study in order to fill in my gaps about the history of New Zealand Parent Center and childbirth education. So in New Zealand, you really divided low risk from high risk. In the United States, everybody took Lamaze classes, regardless. But then they stopped because the new trend, the choice-based, the birthplace trend, was put into place by the 1980s. With no skills. Skills and choices did not go together. That was a gap. That was something I was trying to say to people. Bring them together. Let skills evolve and develop with choices. But the reality is around the world, very few women have choices. And the other reality is you never know what your birth's going to be like. And 99% of the women after the birth will say to you, it's nothing like I imagined it was going to be. So we knew that birth plans and birth choices were only available to a small percent of people, and that normally they did not unfold the way that you'd want them. And in New Zealand, the partnership model was based on choice. So midwives often told me that they would say to clients when they defined the partnership model is that they went to school for 4 years to safeguard the health and well-being of the mother and father, and that they respected women's choices. And what did the woman want of the midwife? Which then is setting up dependency on the midwife by another adult. And fathers were pretty much excluded in New Zealand as well. And here we are, this amazing model that could have been the model that went around the world because there was a strong partnership and technology caught up and more skills-based methods became available for people to self-learn, although many of them are focused still on the natural birth. We now are where we are. And when we put out the flyer in either 2013 or 2016, asking for 100 to 150 of the 3,600 midwives to learn with me how to grow their own strong partnership model, not one midwife in New Zealand did. Not one. And this echoed back to what I was told in 1996 when I talked at the conference. I was approached by well-known midwives after my talk, and I was bluntly told, we will never support anything that you do. And they never did. Your profession never supported me. I didn't care. But they never even thought about strengthening their partnership model by having families self-learn birth and birth coaching skills, because their interpretation of the word natural and normal and physiological was the natural birth interpretation, which is that women birth in a rice paddy. Women don't need skills because cows and cats don't have them. Fathers shouldn't coach. And Michelle O'Donnell just tells people to leave women alone to discover birth. That never was going to work. That hasn't worked. And it won't work in the future. And I know that things have changed in New Zealand, but I don't know what the changes are. I know Andrea is no longer practicing, but she's working at the council about disciplinary things. And the only thing that she tells me is that midwives are taking on too much responsibility, which they have always had. And I have suggested to her that the midwives who are going through the disciplinary action, work with me during that disciplinary time, and I can help them learn to educate their partners to become self-learning, skilled families and see how that works. I'm doing this video a day before I'm coming to New Zealand, and I'm going to go down and meet with Debbie in early February. I'm 81. I have spent 60 years of my life trying to convince dedicated people in childbirth, mostly the natural birth movement, that we need to grow self-learning, skilled birthing families for all births, because the birth is ours. It's not theirs, whatever their viewpoint or philosophy is. It's our memory. When I gave birth in 1970, my husband and I used Lamaze. I did not find those skills as helpful as I would have liked, but I was fully aware that they helped me a lot more than if I hadn't had them, like my mother's generation. By the time I gave birth to my son 12 years later, the Birthing Better skills had primarily begun to develop. Some hadn't yet, but most of them had. And I had been at hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of births. Yes, of course I've delivered babies, but I don't call myself a midwife or a doula. I'm a human being, and I'm working with skilled families. I worked with medically high-risk families, very religious families. Some would never, ever seek medical care under any circumstance. They wanted to try to reduce the potential risks, to reduce potential problems, to reduce potential tragedies. So I had years of working with families who were very self-motivated to learn skills. I gave birth to my son 8 weeks premature, outside of where I was living, with a family I didn't know, and they wanted me to go to the hospital. And I had to make a decision what I was going to do in that hospital. No midwives, obstetrical care, and I was in labor 8 weeks premature. I was not going to argue with them. They were going to do what they wanted to do to safeguard me and my baby. And I was going to use my skills, which I did. And they then stepped back and they watched me deliver my son myself. Andrea can tell you about her experiences. Every person in the ward that day came and watched a woman deliver a baby themselves, because that woman, me, had skills that other men and women had developed that I had carried forward and then used for my own birth. I'm a New Zealand citizen, but when you hear me, you don't see me as a Kiwi, but you do see Andrea as a Kiwi, and you see her as a midwife. She is not as articulate as I am, because I've had to try to sell the message. But she'll talk to you, She's talked at conferences in the past. And you know what the response has been? Very little interest, and mostly saying, well, that's just your practice. Because each practice in New Zealand of every midwife is independent. But it's not independent. It is a profession that has independent practitioners working with the general population. What do you want for the future of your profession? I believe you can get it back. And I believe that the only way you can get it back is to give a message, clear message. You, as a pregnant woman, are going to give birth 100%. It's an activity you're going to do. Here's a list of skills-based methods. Choose one or more. We're going to notate what skills you've learned. And if you're using your skills in birth, we'll praise you. And if you're struggling, we can see which ones from your notes you can use and encourage you to continue to do the activity of birthing your baby using skills. And that's inclusive of your partner, male or female, or loved one, to have shared the same skills with you so that you can work together to build your family. And then the next thing is collecting notes. How's it going for each midwife? Increasingly getting more of their clients to self-learn skills. Which of the skills-based methods does each midwife feel is more effective? Where are the gaps? The Pink Kit is all about body skills, creating space in the body, creating an understanding of how do you get a labor progressing. How do you know whether a labor is progressing or not as a father or a mother? I went away from New Zealand for a while, and when I came back, I was told that they didn't want pain relief used as much, so they were getting women on their hands and knees. So let me explain a little bit about positions before I go. When we were all lying on our back with feet in stirrups, get into that position now. Your pelvis is wide open. It's not a gravity plus position, but your pelvis is open, and your baby likes open pelvises. So the natural birth movement wanted us more gravity plus, so they put us in a semi-recumbent position. So get into that now. You're sitting on your sacrum. That's why women pushed and pushed until blood vessels popped in their eyes, because the baby cannot push out and back the sacrum that is necessary for it to turn the corner under the pubic bone. Midwives are not trained in body work, so they're not paying attention to it. When women were told to stand, nice idea, but when we stand, we tighten up our gluteal muscles. That makes it harder for the baby to open up our pelvis. When we're squatting, if we squat with our legs out to the side, we contract a muscle that runs from the sit bone to the sacrum, and the sacrum becomes fixed. So we are giving information to people that is causing problems. So we want to change that. Why do we want to change it? Because me, personally, I was absolutely enamored with the New Zealand midwifery model. I believe it can be a model that goes around the world, only if a skilled group of midwives are working with a skilled, self-learning, skilled group of families for all births. Andrea will tell you the difference in the birth stories. Andrea will tell you the difference between how women and men work together. So I live in Mexico. I am fine with working with people. We don't care whether people use Birthing Better. We'd like some of them to. It's on the list. We just want midwives to wake up and to understand that your partnership has been not as strong as it can be, and that it is easy to change. One of the things Andrea always said to me is if midwives woke up to this and we all started to get our families to self-learn skills, you'd see a change in 2 years. That's about what she saw. A change in 2 years that existed for another 18 years and could exist forever. The reason the cesarean rate is high is primarily because women are not opening up their body for this big object. And they don't have the skills to cope well. And they don't have a loving member or husband or partner to help them cope. So please consider this, and I hope that you'll work with me. If you have any questions, happy to answer them. How do I feel? Devastated at what's happened with the midwifery model there. Devastated by the statistics. Devastated that a philosophy around birth could not easily be changed to understand that birth is natural, meaning women can freak in labor or cope, or it can be a short labor or long labor, or she can recover fine, or she can have a problem, or the baby can. It is normal, but normal doesn't necessarily mean a good outcome. It is normal for women to bleed, even if it's infrequent. It is normal for women to tear severely, even if it's infrequent. And physiological. It is physiological. But physiological includes everything. Everything. So please consider what I'm saying. I am absolutely committed to working with midwives in New Zealand. And I am asking for $30 a month for a 2-year contract, if I live long enough, to help New Zealand midwives grow a stronger partnership where their clients self-learn birth and birth coaching skills and use those skills because midwives encourage it and insist on it, that is what a strong partnership looks like. So thank you for listening to me.